The Honourable Paul Keating, panellists, ladies and gentlemen. La Trobe University would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay my respect to the elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Good evening. I'm Richard Larkins, Chancellor of La Trobe University, and on behalf of the University, I have great pleasure in welcoming you here tonight to this very significant occasion. I particularly welcome the Honourable Paul Keating and thank him for agreeing to speak. La Trobe University considers it important to engage with the community in commentary and discussion, and its Ideas in Society program, convened by our very distinguished Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, La Trobe Asia, and our Bold Thinking series are all committed to this cause. I will now invite Associate Professor Claire Wright to introduce Paul Keating and the other panellists and describe the format for the evening. Claire is a Principal Research Fellow in History and ARC Future Fellow at La Trobe. She won the 2014 Stella Prize for her book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, and among many other significant contributions has written the ABC's Utopia Girls, How Women Won the Vote, and The War That Changed Us, and is currently working on a new series for Radio National. Please welcome Claire Wright. Thank you.
I just broke the equipment. I too would like to thank by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I recognise that this has always been a place of convivial conversation and vigorous debate. I also respectfully acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It's an honour to have been asked to introduce our speakers tonight on behalf of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe. One of these men needs no introduction. One of them is likely to be quite familiar to you. And one of them, by his own admission to me yesterday, is not very important. That's you, Nick. So let's start with Nick Bisley, who will facilitate the discussion this evening. Professor Nick Bisley is the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia and Professor of International Relations. His research expertise is in Asia's international relations, globalisation, and the diplomacy of great powers. Nick is currently the Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Journal of International Affairs and is a Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and a member of the Council for Security and Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. He has been a Senior Research Associate of the International Institute of Strategic Studies and a Visiting Fellow at the East-West Centre in Washington, D.C. You see, not very important. Seated to Nick's left is Alan Gyngell. Professor Gyngell is Director of the Crawford Australian Leadership Forum and an Adjunct Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He was the Director General of the Australian Office of National Assessments from 2009 to 2013. Before his appointment to ONA, Professor Gyngell was the founding Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney. He has published and spoken extensively on Australian foreign policy, Asian regional relations, and the development of global and regional institutions. Professor Gyngell has served as an Australian diplomat in Rangoon, Singapore and Washington, and between 1993 and 1996, he was a senior advisor to the Prime Minister Paul Keating. Which brings me to the man who needs no introduction. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that Paul Keating is a man who could be introduced in many ways. He was, of course, Australia's Treasurer from 1983 to 1991 and our Prime Minister from 1991 to 1996. He could also be introduced as the Bankstown boy who left school at 15 and went on to be awarded honorary doctorates in laws from Keio University in Tokyo, the National University of Singapore, and the University of New South Wales in his hometown of Sydney. He is the great orator of the Redfern speech and the Mabo address, the pensive author of Engagement, Australia Faces the Asia Pacific, published in 2000, and the potent hurler of invectives, like unrepresentative swill, arse end of the world, and my personal favourite, all tip, no iceberg. But it is with one of Paul Keating's most infamous aphorisms that I'd like to centre this particular introduction, Banana Republic. As Treasurer and then Prime Minister, Paul Keating oversaw far-reaching economic reforms, including the progressive deregulation of the financial sector, the float of the Australian dollar, extensive tax reform, and this dismantling of many protectionist barriers. These reforms assisted the expansion of the Australian economy. And I know that because I took those words directly from his website. But I think these reforms also produced a tectonic shift in the imaginative landscape of Australia. Keating had a vision of where people were going to work. It was as if he was standing on the paddock where 50 years ago a new university was built. It was as if he was looking out from the Agora at La Trobe, peering west across the plains of the soon-to-be-empty factories of Australia's former manufacturing heartland. By the 1980s, Keating knew that the first-in family students who flocked to La Trobe, a university assembled on the values of justice and inclusion, of equity and outreach, he knew that these students would not take up the jobs of their parents. Not only because these students would have professional opportunities their migrant, working class and rural parents could only dream of, but also because their parents' jobs would no longer exist. So, just as the freedom fighters of the 1850s gold rush rebelled against the monopoly on land that blocked their entree to social mobility and political power, so Paul Keating defied the monopoly on money that created hierarchies of wealth, ownership and employment. The graduates of La Trobe University disproportionately benefited from Keating's financial revolution. His reforms have offered access to finance to a generation of migrants, women, Indigenous Australians, and all manner of freaks and geeks, so that we could be the entrepreneurs and small business owners, the writers and the artists, the intellectuals and the innovators of a new Australia, where business ceased to be the conservative cult of insiders and became the risky business of outliers. For that, we all owe him a huge debt, including our HECS debts. I hope that you can see that there is a natural fit between Paul Keating and La Trobe University. Instead of using changes to the financial industry to isolate, barricade and keep people out, Paul Keating gave us an inclusive, expansive, fractal economy. The same economy for which La Trobe is providing the first-rate education and training for a generation and class of workers for whom big ideas, open hearts and loud mouths are a badge of honour. I'd now like to turn you over to Nick Bisley to lead tonight's discussion about Australia's place in the world and in the region in the era of Trump, a leader who might not even be Tip.
Thank you, Claire. We're gathered here at a time in which I think there is a profound sense of change and possibly even the notion of a kind of historical inflection point in our region and indeed the world, prompted most obviously by the rise of China, but also that sort of punctuation mark of the global financial crisis that seemed to signify this not only the end of a kind of neoliberal era of excess, but potentially the end of that long boom that brought Western dominance to sort of its apex. And as China rose, we saw a kind of US decline in which, if you looked it up in a dictionary, you would have seen a picture of President Trump embodying the sense of decline. And yet, there is in every era a sense that we are living through a period of profound change. When Alan first led the Lowy Institute, their very first publication was a short pamphlet or book called Changing Utterly. And in the first chapter, Alan referred to a book that he bought as a first-year recruit to what was then the Department of External Affairs, which said in 1969 that Australia has never lived through a more profound period of change than the current period. So my sense, I think the first opening question is really, what's your sense, Paul, of this extent of change in which we are living? And what do you think are going to be the big forces that are shaping the world over the coming decades with which Australia, as we look out into this changing world, is going to have to grapple? What are the big forces that we're going to have to manage and cope with?
Yeah. Well, Coral Bell, the defence strategist, talked about the end of the Vasco da Gama era, the era when Europeans dominated the Eastern world, European imperialism. I think what happened was the Americans at the end of the war, particularly Roosevelt, tried to seek an end of colonialism and succeeded. No more the British in India, no more the Dutch in Indonesia, no more the French in Indochina. But what happened, I think the Cold War snap froze. It snap froze that development. And so it was not until 1989, when the wall comes down, and 1991, when the Soviet Union is dissolved, that bipolarity between the United States and the Soviet Union that was switched off. The magnets were switched off. And all of a sudden, open regionalism becomes possible. And more than that, these great societies like India and China, Indonesia, start finding their own way. And what we are living with now is that development. The point was that the state at the top of the system, the United States, which induced this condition, didn't have a plan for it, didn't understand what forces it was letting loose. And of course they were forces for good, and so these great states which were riven with poverty all of a sudden are becoming major economies again. I mean, China is returning to the place it was at the top of the system before the Industrial Revolution, which was inconceivable in 1989 or 90. So basically, the world is returning to the basic shape it had before the Industrial Revolution, and that's being led by the Chinese.
Yeah, that's that sense that you have over, if the proverbial Martian had come down and looked at global economic history over the past 2,000 years, for the vast bulk of that period, that's centred in and around Asia, and particularly around China, with that exception of that kind of the past 200 years. And economists like to describe that as this great divergence. That technology, particularly in ideas, gives a small group of the population of the planet this disproportionate advantage, and that advantage is essentially coming to an end. But what does that mean to now go back to the world in which scale, size, population now has once again a kind of straight line correlation to power and influence? Does that mean we go back to a world of kind of unremitting contest and conflict between big, powerful states in which small countries, relatively speaking, are literally at the mercy of the powerful? Or is there some way in which we can moderate that contest? Or is it, as the old metaphor goes, when the elephants fight, the small get crushed?
Well, you're right, the Industrial Revolution broke the nexus between population and GDP. Before 1800, the work of any one of us was of equal value. We clothed ourselves, we fed ourselves, we housed ourselves. There was no shift in productivity across the globe. So therefore, the states with the largest populations had the largest GDP. And China had the largest GDP before 1800. But all of a sudden, a little state like Britain, discovers congealed energy, coal, produces steam, and the Industrial Revolution starts, and all of a sudden its GDP is larger than China. What is happening now? What globalisation has done? It has made the capital and the technology ubiquitous. And so we're now rejoining the link between population and GDP. So we're going back to the world that did obtain before the Industrial Revolution. And you're right, we're going to have these big states, India, China, as well as, of course, the Atlantic states, and yet the coming great states of Africa. This is the world we're going to be living in. So the days of sort of comfortable multilateralism, superintended by the United States, along sort of Jeffersonian principles, this is fading away to a world of great power entities again, and great power politics again. And in that world, it's just a much harder world for a country like Australia to live in.
Alan, you've just published, product placement here, La Trobe University Press book, the second book off the newly relaunched La Trobe University Press, a history of the 75 years of Australian foreign policy. Given that historical sweep that you've covered, what's your sense of how Australia can navigate a world, as Paul says, in which great power rivalry is a much greater force?
Well, one of the things that's clear if you look back at the 75 years of Australian foreign policy since the Second World War is that one of the ways in which we have tried to address the sort of fundamental existential point that we are a country with global interests, but will never have the weight to make to enforce our will by power alone. We've believed from the beginning that an international order in which the rules, whether the rules are of trade or the law of the sea or disarmament, are known and which we've played a part in running. Now that's been easy for us for the past 75 years because the rules have basically been set by us and our mates. We didn't, we were active when we had to be, but we didn't have to lead the pack. But for all the reasons that Paul was just alluding to, that's changing. So if we want to continue to have such a world, and that will always be better for us, we're going to have to be, I believe, be much more active in striding out into the middle of the field with a banner on a large pole saying rules-based order, and finding ways of putting together sort of new coalitions of interest around the things that matter to us. The rules-based order, however, has always been partly a way of constraining the actions of great powers, but it's also always reflected that order, just as at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations and the World Bank and so on were set up in the in the US. That shift is coming too, and it means that China will be much more important in what's to come.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, Alan's right. See, we're going to we're returning to a great power political world. Multilateralism is becoming much less important, and we've always, in a sense, been internationalists. But as Alan said, the rules have been written by our friends. Now the rules have been written by a whole lot of people. And you know the old saying, you know, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's what we should be doing. Instead of that, we've got this sort of what I call the wimp policy. Oh, please, the United States, oh, please don't let our hand go. Please, don't leave us, please hang on. You know, this is the Julie Bishop line, you know, and the Kim Beazley line. There's a whole lot of people that have this line. Oh, please don't let us go, you know. And meanwhile, this massive state has risen in the East, China, which will have huge influences on East Asia. And the United States will remain important. But you know, people go on about the American alliance. We've been with them since 1914. We went into battle with them, I think, in 1918. That's 100 years ago next year. I mean, do you really need to get the marriage certificate out every week? You know, no, but they are, you know, all those good little Americans in the government and in the opposition, they got the marriage certificate out. The alliance, you know, I mean, it's pathetic. You know?
Now, I want to dig into the alliance in a little while, but before we get to that, something you mentioned, Paul, that I think has been crucial to the world we're in now, which is globalisation and the way in which it's fueled opportunities. I mean, the integration of China into the global economy has been the greatest story in human development history. Sure. More people lifted out of poverty more quickly than at any point in our past. Yet, there is a sense that possibly the mood around globalisation has soured. That's to say, the wave has crested with, you know, globalisation was made possible by decisions that countries, particularly the United States, but others, made to be open to capital, to be open to people, to be open to ideas. And yet, wherever you look, certainly in the OECD world, but not only, whether it's Trump, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Le Pen, whether it's people like Modi, Abe, there's a sense that there's a kind of nationalism is resurgent and a sense of mercantilism. I mean, only this morning, you know, Vice President Pence has just finished another reassurance tour around Asia, including here, and yet this morning Donald Trump saying he's going to rip up the free trade agreement with Korea and charge them $1 billion for the theatre high-altitude air defence system. Mercantilism seems to be difficult it's going to be difficult for Trump to shove back in the bottle. What's your sense of that balance between openness of globalisation and nationalism that's out there?
Well, there's a difference between globalisation and globalism. What we're seeing now is a rejection of globalism, not globalisation. And globalism is not a long-dated concept. It really started after the end of the Cold War. It started in 1992, and it really finished in 2008 with the American financial crisis. Right? So it went for sort of, you know, less than 20 years, around 20 years. This is when the Americans talked about in the great celebration at the end of the Cold War, in the rise of the American stock markets and the dot-com boom. They talked about, you know, this was the end of history. You know, we're all going, it's all over, said Frank Fukuyama, it's all over. The Jeffersonians have won. We're going to have a world which reflects this sort of democracy. We're going to have a consensus about the way economies work. We're going to have a consensus about the world power order with the US at the top. And so they went. And of course, this all collapsed after Iraq and after 2008 in the financial crisis. So if you take Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, he made a speech in Davos recently in favour of globalisation. But he's absolutely opposed to globalism, which is lining up in a proprietary structure behind the United States in an Atlantic-dominated world with Atlantic institutions. So, you know, China's now ripping, as Alan said, you know, they're no longer interested in the IMF and the World Bank, you know. They're setting up their own investment banks, the AIIB, the Silk Road Fund. They have the Chinese financial reserves abroad are larger than the IMF's free reserves, so it doesn't need the IMF, right? So what we're seeing, whenever you hear that Xi Jinping speak, he always talks about a new system of global governance, which is code for saying not an American one, right? So, and they want a UN-based one, you know? And so therefore, this is not a rejection of globalisation. That is the ubiquity of the money and the technology. It's not a rejection of that, or the trade. It's a rejection of the one-size-fits-all strategic policy.
I think you can take it back a bit further than that, too, Nick. The war aims of the Allies at the end of the Second World War were globalising, normatively globalising. They saw a world in which a United Nations organisation would run things. There would be international institutions. Trade was to be open and global. Even the Cold War was a global conflict between two great powers. But I think that sort of normative sense that what we're after is a great cosmopolitan world. I think that's temporarily, perhaps, but certainly fading at the moment.
Let's turn to China, because it is, that's the sort of the big game changer. Paul, you've spoken several times about the need for China to be given space and for China to be accommodated. What do you think the region looks like? What does an Asia look like in which the PRC is given its space? And how comfortable are we as a liberal democratic society with a China-centric Asia with the Chinese Communist Party at the centre of it?
Well, whether we are comfortable or not, Nick, it's happening, right? It's happening. I mean, what's happening in China knows no precedent in world economic history. There's nothing ever been like this before, and nothing will ever be like it again, because we won't ever have 1.25 billion people so competently directed by a single authoritative state as we now have. I mean, even if India, at roughly the same population, kicks on, the chances of them doing what the Chinese done is low, or even a bunch of African states. It's wealth on a scale we've never seen. Beijing has already 100 billionaires. You see that figure the other day, 100 billionaires just in Beijing. And at the moment, Chinese incomes per capita are 20% of US incomes per capita. Right? Japan, which is, of course, the mother of all developing countries, got in 1989 at its peak, got to 70% of US incomes, 90% of US incomes per capita. And after the long, if you like, recession in Japan, it's now down to 70. Now, it's not likely that 1.25 billion Chinese are going to get to 70% of US incomes per capita. But at over 20 now, it's likely that they'll get to 50%. They could get to 50, the great bulk of them. 50% of US incomes, but 4 times as many of them. So half of 4 is 2. They end up an economy twice as large as the US. So if they get to 50% of US incomes per capita, the Chinese GDP is twice as large as America's. So the idea that this great massive economy is going to be a strategic client of the United States, that they are kept in line by the US 7th Fleet, that the US 7th Fleet patrols its coasts 6 miles off the outside the territorial sea, is of course a nonsense. But this is what the pivot was all about. This is what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's pivot was all about. Was about the re-establishment of US power and the maintenance of US hegemony in Asia. You know, it's simply unreal. And if we try and remain party to that piece of nonsense, you know, that's not to say we don't need the US strategically in Asia as a balancing and conciliating power. We do. But if we are party to the nonsense that we will line up with the United States to maintain its strategic hegemony in Asia over China, we must have troubles. You know, we must have great troubles. So I'm just hoping that this new relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping is one where the US starts to sort of wake up to the whole thing about scale, and power. And military power comes with economic power. And even though those Chinese won't have the same income as those Americans, as a nation, they'll have the wherewithal to have the kind of external reflection, including in their military and their navy, as any great power has. So, as you said at the outset, this may be uncomfortable for us. Before the Industrial Revolution, China was number one, and it had a tributary system of states which all bowed and genuflected to them. Let's hope we're not going to be bowing and genuflecting, but the reality of that power is there, and we would be, well advised to start accommodating it and to adjust ourselves to it, instead of trying to hide behind the American flag like a bunch of good little Americans, saying, "Oh no, what we need is more Uncle Sam,"
But how does, I guess there's sort of two parts to the question. One is like, how does a country like Australia influence a country like China, given the disparity of scale and...
By being a bit clever. By being a bit clever. I mean, I talked the Chinese into the APEC leaders meeting. Kevin Rudd encouraged them into the East Asian Summit. We were doing clever things. But if you insist upon being dumb, you get treated as though you're dumb.
The second part's the slightly more challenging one, which is the democratic values question and the human rights question, which is, it's not... I think often when you talk about China and people in my line of business sort of think about great power relations and material issues of balance of power and this sort of stuff. But there's the more, I think in some respects, more important issues of values. And that's where, certainly at the moment, we've had this international period where our values are being neatly aligned and defended by a global order that's broadly in line with those. We're now entering a world in which our values are going to be just one of a series of values that are in competition, if you like. How do we advocate for and defend those values in the face of an extraordinarily powerful political institution that, is at best suspicious of, if downright hostile to those values?
Well, I think we believe in those values, but we should be careful what we attempt to propagate. The Americans they're saying they are the exceptional country with these values, that it is their mission to propagate these values. And we've seen the propagation in Iraq. We've seen the propagation in the Arab Spring. We've seen the propagation in Libya. We've seen the propagation in all of these states. And so therefore, the idea that the Chinese state, with its Communist Party, which brought it together, and its sort of general Confucian sense of itself, should in some way, accommodate a set of broadly East Coast American values, which are shared by states like us, is simply, a naive view of how the world really works. And that's not to say that we would endorse abuses of human rights in China. We don't, and we've spoken about them often. But in the end, China is a patchwork quilt of prosperities. And to hold it together and to achieve what they've done, taking 600 million people out of poverty, requires some measure of central government and authority. And no OECD country could have done what the Chinese have done, not one. So what human right do we establish or attach to taking someone out of abject poverty, to taking 600 million of them out of abject poverty to live good lives in decent accommodation with proper clothes, medicines, etc.? Or are we just hung up about the fact that some detainees don't get proper legal representation? You know what I mean? I mean, where is, in our mind, where's the weight of judgment about the Chinese, what they've actually produced, what they've actually done? So human values go more than just human rights, I think, of the kind that we normally associate ourselves with.
It's the sort of sense of the sort of collective advancement of the Chinese people weighed against the rights of individuals, and clearly we know where the party falls down on that one.
I mean, nation building is a tough caper. Nation building is a tough caper. And therefore, the Communist Party pulled the country together after European imperialism had ripped it apart and the Japanese had ripped it apart. And that government of theirs has been the best government in the world in the last 30 years. Full stop. The most successful government in the world in the last 30 years.
This is probably a useful segue to turn to President Trump. Do you think President Trump and his administration present a risk of one form or another to Asia or to Australia?
Sorry, Nick, I just missed that word.
Do you think, or to what extent possibly even, do you think President Trump presents a risk to Asia or to Australia in its policies and its outlook?
Well, as American presidents go, he's obviously the wild joker in the pack, right? We don't know really how he will conduct himself, right? But he's had a couple of reasonable ideas. One is that the US should have a better relationship with China, and we'd all applaud that, because the sort of lives we live in this country depends upon the US and China finding common cause in the Pacific. Right? So if there's peace in the Pacific, our lives are going to be that much better. And the other idea he had was to have a better relationship with Russia. That great state that has essentially borne the brunt of West European militarism, with Bonaparte, with Hitler, and now in a sort of standoff with the EU. And so the great challenge for the Americans is to find a place for Russia in Europe. Not that they'll ever be part of the EU system, but to find a point of some sort of harmony and accommodation, which the Americans decided not to do by extending NATO in 1997, by biting off bits of the old Soviet Union. Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states all put into NATO. And of course this produced amongst Russian nationalists a great reaction. In a sense, the Americans produced Putin, So he's got that idea. So you certainly would not have got that idea out of the State Department. Right? And I don't think you get the same idea about China out of the State Department. So maybe he may be the wild card, but maybe that we make progress on these two big fronts.
What about the forces that propelled Trump to the White House? Because I think there's often a fixation on Trump and his personality and his exuberance, shall we say. But behind him, that sense of electoral fragmentation between, and disenchantment with existing parties, not only in the US, it's across liberal democracies. That sense of a hollowed out middle class that used to have a kind of pathway And certainly it's a constituency that this university believes is core to the well-being of a liberal society. Do you think that sense of an America that is being sort of left behind presents a profound challenge for the world? That's to say, an America that feels like America first, of the kind that Trump has articulated, is a force that weakens Australia or weakens the liberal international order? Or is it just, as you said, is it something that's just happening and we're just going to have to come to terms with it?
Well, there is no doubt that globalisation hollowed America out. It hollowed Britain out. In some respects, it's in our manufacturing, it's hollowed us out too. You know, in the international division of labour, the great states in Asia with big populations, with globalisation and the abolition of tariffs, have been able to displace big sections of manufacturing industries in the developed countries. You know, this is true. But there's also been great employment in the service sectors of these economies, like there has in this country, you know. I mean, the people who are on the assembly line in the car plants are now working in the financial industries, or they're working in hospitality, or they're working in health, you know. So what Trump did in the election was say, globalisation's hollowed us out. That Hillary Clinton, she believes in globalisation. She believes in free trade. I don't. You know, I'll stick up for you. You know, and you've got to remember, he won the 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan and Iowa, I think it was.
Ohio.
By less than one,
Ohio.
Ohio, by less than 1%. Less than 1%. Hillary Clinton didn't even visit Wisconsin. The Democrats took their constituency cheaply. Hillary said, I'm pretty good, I've been here a long time, and it's my turn. You know? And he said, through to all that, you've been robbed, I'll protect you, I'll make America great again.
You were, much earlier than anyone else I know, you were talking about Trump as a possible victor from, I don't know, July, August last year. So I was surprised when Hillary Clinton lost, you weren't. What was it that you saw in Trump himself?
Well, the enormous inner confidence. He was the enormous inner confidence. He's a momentum player. Basically, probably a narcissist, you know. There's a bit of that in all of us. But I haven't been gazing in any pools lately. But nevertheless, you know, I thought he's going to scatter those Republican candidates. He threw them in the corner like rag dolls, you know. And I thought, that's what he's going to do with you, Hillary. He's going to throw you in the corner. Now, it turns out Hillary got the majority of the votes in the United States. But because of the Electoral College, a bit like our Senate, where we give 12 Senate seats to Victoria, but 12 also to Tasmania, I mean, almost everyone, every street corner down there has got a public job, you know. That distortion in our Senate is similarly reflected in the Electoral College. Now, if you're a Democrat and you know this and you've been doing it for years, and Bill Clinton did it for years and everything else, then what you do is you shore up your base. But they didn't. Hillary Clinton's problem is she didn't have a story, and Trump had a story. Now, I was telling someone the other day. They said, you know, the displacement of people in factories in America, it's happened 30 years ago. You know, Billy Joel wrote that song Allentown, you know, how we're living here in Allentown, you know, and they're closing all the factories down. Out in Bethlehem, they're standing in line, filling out forms and standing in line. That was written in 1983. It was on then. And Trump's saying he's got the remedy now. Of course, there is no remedy. I mean, these policy is a con, fundamentally. It's not going to work, you know. And the people in Iowa and Ohio will wake up at some point to the fact. But the point is, he might just induce a shift in growth and wealth of a kind they get some part of. And if he can kick that economy of his along by 0.5% or 1% of GDP, he'll get a second term. That's the point of it.
Well, why don't we turn now to Australia? And something you've said recently is that, in fact, I think you said it at the Keith Murdoch oration a few years ago, that Australia is a derivative power as a Western power. Do you think that still pertains, or is it worse? Is Australia as a Western outpost still the way we operate? And sort of as a second question at the same time, Australia is changing fundamentally. The culture of Australia as a society, it's a different place from when I grew up, and it's a profoundly different place from when my parents grew up here. To what extent do you see that as beginning to play out into how Australia thinks about itself in the world and the way it identifies with its foreign policy and shapes its foreign policy orientation?
Yeah, well, the country is unled. We still have the Queen of Great Britain as our head of state, for Christ's sake. I mean, it's an affront to everything we've created here that our head of state isn't one of us. But we still have the Queen as our head of state. I mean, we have as Alan says in his book, Fear of Engagement, which was the cause of our doing this discussion, that we made this audacious claim. Here we were, a little colony in Sydney Harbour, a little group of people who said, thank you, we'll have the whole continent of Australia. I mean, the gall of it. You know what I mean? Apart from the damage and dispossession to the Indigenes, the gall of it. And, but the fact is, we have a continent to our own and a border with nobody. And all of the states we've mentioned tonight, Russia, the United States, China, they've all got borders, countries on their borders. We don't. So therefore, we've been given this great inheritance. I mean, you would be in there trying to reorder the whole East Asian system to suit us. That's what I was trying to do back 25 years ago with the APEC leaders meeting, getting the US engaged in Asia, getting China into the thing, sitting the Chinese and the Japanese down together, us sitting down with the Indonesians, you would take this on with such gusto, But you've got to do some things right. You've got to say, we can't have the monarch of another country as our head of state. We can't have a flag with the flag of another country in its corner, We can't maintain the policy that we have in respect of the Indigenes, or the general, notwithstanding a lot of interest and kindliness on the part of the Australian community, the fact we've never actually busted that problem. So we go to Asia. We should be going to Asia as a sort of as the new Australian people, as the continent which has turned a leaf, But here we have Tony Abbott a couple of years ago, bringing back knighthoods. I mean, he gave poor old Prince Philip a knighthood. You can imagine what he said when he found out. And there they are, the Liberal Party lickspittles. They'll be over there at Whitehall, looking for their baroncies, and like Ming the Merciless, what was he, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, Menzies, Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. I mean, getting around the gown with the thing. I mean, these people had no idea about the future of the Australian nation in Asia, and that was before China turned into what it is now. I mean, so if you see the shift in the world of the kind Alan's describing and I'm describing, you'd be hitting the panic button. No, they're all on the Valium tablets. This bunch, I mean, this is a cabinet which pops a Bland tablet every morning. And so as a consequence, the place is unled. It is unled, and and the fact is, even through some of the last recent Labor governments, neither Kevin Rudd nor Gillard did anything to change the Republic. They said, "Oh, we'll wait till the Queen dies." I said, "Well, that'd make us a brave bunch, wouldn't it? Wait till the old lady dies, and we'll take the crown from her."
But why do you think it is that we're in this period? I mean, it is a period of opportunism. I mean, it's a great opportunity for a political leader. Political leaders' great legacies are often to do with circumstance. You happen to come in, and there is, you've got crises.
You'd be thrilled every day.
Yeah, and yet, on both sides of the aisle, there is this sort of quiescence. There's a timidity around the kind of role Australia should play. What's your sense of what drives that? I mean, it's not just that they're popping the bland pills. There's a reason they're reaching for them.
The lack of imagination. That's what the two ingredients in leadership are imagination and courage. Seeing the big vista, and then having the wherewithal to go and move towards it. And now there isn't the imagination. It's not true of everyone in public life. I mean, people go into public life in both parties to serve the country and serve them well, And I could name names on both sides of politics in doing that. But there's nothing like the power of a big idea to remake the debate. People say, "Oh, look, it's so hard now." If you were in public life now with social media, you wouldn't have been able to do what you did in the past. Well, there's an even greater role for the Pied Piper now, because in the age of self-expression, which is in the me age, the iPhone, everything's I, me, I, self-expression. They're always looking for the one person who has the central ideas. Yep. And if you don't have the central ideas, you don't get the following. So what happens? You're then subject to the static. The static reigns. The static wins. And so you get pushed around by, it used to be the old Canberra Press Gallery. God loved them. Only God could love them, by the way. But now it's all this, the twits on Twitter.
So I want to go back to something you said and be interested also in Alan's views on this, that you said there's still a place for an American strategic presence in Asia, and there's still a place for the alliance. Yes, we don't need perhaps to pull out the marriage license every day, but it's there. How do what role does the alliance play, or should the alliance play, for an Australia that's carving out a more distinctive role for itself in a world in which China plays a much greater role in our future? How do we square those? Because there's a sense that the autopilot to Washington comes out of a sense that that's the world we know, and anything other than that is deeply unfamiliar and risky. How do we bring these two things together?
Well, I'd like to hear what Alan says. Let me have a go at it first. If you've been in a strategic partnership of a kind with the United States for 100 years, do you have to have a fear every week that they may not like what you say about this or that matter, or that you may not join them in escapades in some country or another? Really? I mean, you'd have to have a low sense of self-regard and a low sense of confidence to think that somehow you would lose the Americans. We would never lose the Americans. I mean, who else around this part of the world has a continent? English language culture, common jurisprudence. I mean, we couldn't shake the Americans off if we tried. And that is the truth. But no, we go on now. Oh, look, we won't say anything about. Oh, we better send a boat through the South China Sea because some American admiral in Honolulu has suggested if we don't do it, the Americans are going to think badly of us. This is all defeatist, bad talk. The truth is, the Americans are entirely important to the peace and good order of East Asia. And having them there as a balancing power, as Britain was in the 19th century, when the Germans, when Bonaparte was afoot with the Germans and conquering the rest of Europe, Britain stood off as a balancing power, as it did with Kaiser Wilhelm in the 1890s and as it did in the run-up to the First World War. You know, it had that balancing role and conciliating role. Similarly, I think the Americans should enjoy that role in Asia, and we need them to. I mean, that's the point. We need them to. But what we don't need them doing is trying to maintain the game like it was at the end of the Second World War. That is, to frame and guarantee East Asia to turn or attempt to turn China into a client state, because the Chinese just will never be a client state of the United States. So that policy won't work. What will work? Being a balancer and a conciliator, you know. But if you say that now to some of the sort of the policy wimp brigade here, they say, oh, you know, this is an affront to the United States. You know, this is an affront to the... No, it's a real place for them. It's a real place for them, recognising the great power of China, you know. So, you know, we just should, you know, we got to really rely upon a piece of paper written in what, 1954, Alan? When was the thing? 54 or something. You know, say, oh, well, there it is, the American alliance, which is just an agreement to consult one another in times of trouble, you know, or running over to this dialogue, which they have every year, where they all bow down in Washington, you know. We can do better. And we can articulate a place for the Americans that they are at this point incapable of articulating for themselves.
Something strange happened to the discussion about the US relationship, I think, in the course of the 21st century, which wasn't there as I've been writing the history of the 20th. The alliance took on what Paul separately has described as sort of a sacramental quality. You could see it in government documents. Suddenly started using the word alliance with a capital A. Things changed from a small A alliance to a large A alliance. So it's you know, after 9/11 really, it's taken on a different weight in the Australian debate, and an unnecessary weight, I think. I mean, I agree with Paul. I mean, it's important. It gives us great advantages in intelligence and other things. It's worthwhile. We share interests, but it's a thing. It's a treaty. It's not ordained by God.
All right, we now have around 25 minutes to take questions from the audience. Now, the problem is there's lots of you. There's 2 microphones here, and there's a microphone up there. We're going to ask those who are keen and swift on their feet. We'll probably have time for about 6 to 8. So you're going to have to get out and around. So if you're in the middle, your negotiating skills will need to be fairly impeccable. In the interim, I wanted to ask Paul a question about the venue. You're a person who has great taste in music. I wanted to get your reflections on the Melbourne Recital Hall.
Oh, have a look at it. It's wonderful, isn't it? Wonderful. You know, it's you might remember, but I did an economic statement. The first thing I did as Prime Minister in 1992, called One Nation. Of course, that name was purloined by you-know-who. But in that, I built the recitals, funded the recitals, similar recital centre in Sydney, which is a fantastic place for, you know, concerts and piano and soloists, etc., even an orchestra. You know.
Even an orchestra. All right, I think we have our assembled masses. We'll start on this side here. If I could ask everyone to keep their questions as A, questions, and B, short.
This isn't Q&A on the ABC. Mr. Keating, thank you so much, and thank you to our other panellists. I've just finished reading Engagement, where you touch on Taiwan and North Korea, and talk about the troubles there you faced as Prime Minister in trying to engage with the Asia Pacific. Suddenly, under Trump, Taiwan and North Korea are big questions once again. Where do we go there? So in trying to deal with this emergent China and have a friendly and productive relationship with them. How do we deal with the question of a very democratic Taiwan and an ever-challenging North Korea?
Well, I think that it has been Chinese national policy, it has been American national policy, that there is one China, which also includes Taiwan. The government of the PRC say to the Taiwanese, you can have your own political system, you can have your own currency, you can have your own defence force, you can have your own flag, but you cannot say you're not Chinese. Right? This is the one country, two systems that Deng Xiaoping talked about. And while President Trump perhaps inadvisedly decided to have this telephone call with the president of Taiwan, he has since accepted, in a conversation with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, he's since accepted a return, that is, if they ever left, to the one China policy. So I don't know whether Alan disagrees with that. I don't really think that Taiwan, short of President Trump shifting his position, as he might have indicated earlier, that Taiwan is an issue of the kind that you might think it is in the implication of your question. North Korea is a different issue altogether. The nuclear genie got out of the bottle in 1945, and we haven't been able to get it back there. Through science and espionage, the Russians had an atomic weapon very quickly after the Americans, and of course the British, which were part of the Manhattan Project, and high theoretical capabilities, were able to develop a weapon, and not long later the French. And we had the weapon states, and China felt that, given its power and its size, that it should have a nuclear weapon too, and developed it. The great pity is we never removed nuclear weapons after at the end of the Cold War. You know, Reagan, in the famous meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan at Reykjavik in 1986, Gorbachev offered Reagan the complete destruction and abolition of nuclear weapons, all nuclear weapons, and all intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Reagan wanted to take that offer up. I mean, Reagan's always pictured, you know, as somebody who was a bit lightweight, you know. But Reagan actually wanted to take the Gorbachev offer. But he had some dark princes in the American strategic family, Richard Pearl, Prince among them, saying, don't give up Star Wars, because the Gorbachev offer was to get rid of the nukes and the missiles and Star Wars, the SDI, the Strategic Defence Initiative, where the Americans put an offensive set of weapons in the sky. As you know, Star Wars has never happened. But because of Star Wars, Reagan refused Gorbachev's offer. So we never got rid of nukes. I became Prime Minister, and Alan and I together established a body called the Canberra Commission for the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons in 1995, the first Western government to say, let's be rid of them. Let's be rid of them. And we had the former French Prime Minister, Michel Rocard. We had the former US Defence Secretary, Robert McNamara, the Chief of Strategic Command. We had all of these people. And the Canberra Commission was the basic de-nuking document of the world. But it was presented to John Howard and to Alexander Downer, and they just put it in a drawer. They buried it, you know. Because we could see the non-proliferation genie running. Firstly, Israel, then Pakistan, then India, First India, then Pakistan. And of course, as you know, we had in there as well Iraq. We had in Iraq, we had Libya trying, and we had Iran. You see, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has a bargain at its centre. It says the weapon states undertake, the non-weapon states like Australia, undertake not to acquire nuclear weapons if the weapon states agree to be rid of them. That's the fundamental bargain in the treaty. Well, the bargain was breached, always. The nuclear states have held on to the weapons, have never been rid of them. So what's good for the good guys is also good for the bad guys. Right? So the bad guys said, well, look, if they can have them, we can have them too. You see? So when Pakistan got them, they started giving the North Koreans the technology, the centrifuge technology, to reprocess electricity generation, nuclear plant material into weapons-grade uranium. Frankly, North Korea is already a nuclear weapon state. It's not might be. North Korea is already a nuclear weapon state. What it's developing now is the delivery systems for these. It wants to become a fully fledged nuclear weapon state. And it may be possible to push them back through economic sanctions into a position that Iran has adopted. But Iran is a real country. Iran is a real society. And it's responded to American and European end treaties to reach a standstill on its nuclear program. But North Korea is not a real country. You know, it's a sort of a little fiefdom, you know, corruptly managed. And so therefore the idea that we're going to get a North Korean response to the same things we got in Iran is I think highly unlikely. There is another more worrying point about North Korea, and it is this: that because in this little poor country so much of its GDP is wrapped up in the nuclear program, we reach a point where even if Kim Jong-un decided to abolish nuclear weapons or abolish the program, that may take him down and all the people around him who support it. In other words, it could be, I hope it isn't, but it could be that the weapons program is their raison d'etre. It's the reason for their existence, and without it they don't maintain control of the state. So therefore, the simple idea we have, and we've for years going on, I mean, this is a big problem, I'm not saying this is easy, that we can negotiate them into some sort of a standstill position is probably, you know, naive. In which case, it may be that we will have to contain a North Korea, nuclear North Korea, like we had to contain the Soviet Union. In other words, it will have the weapons and it will have the delivery systems and it will be able to nuke all sorts of countries, but it knows it'll have massive retaliation if it happens. And so we deal with North Korea with a containment policy. I know there is a view around, the Americans say the Chinese have let us down and the Chinese should have got rid of nukes in North Korea. But the Americans could not even stop the Israelis from developing North Korea's nuclear weapons. I mean, all the influence America has on Israel, it couldn't stop the Israeli nuclear program. So it may be, as the Chinese say, it's unfair to put on us the responsibility of actually the cessation of the program. So this is a very big problem, whereas I don't think Taiwan is a similar problem.
All right, we'll have one over here.
So earlier this evening, you were talking about this idea of course, globalisation and multilateralism, and how along the lines of you said that multilateralism was not as much value or as prominent in today's society, and I always was I had always thought that globalization and multilateralism had gone kind of hand in hand, and so I was kind of wondering whether you could expand on the point about why multilateralism was not as important when globalization was a part of it.
Yeah.
It sounds like an end of semester essay question.
Well, multilateralism at the end of the great schism of World War I and World War II. We're still all living with World War I, even to this day. It was a founding cause of World War II. And the Americans, God bless them, had this utopian view of the world after the war, that they would rebuild Europe and they would rebuild Japan, they would remove colonialism, and they did all these things. And they set up the Bretton Woods institutions, and from that we saw a United States of Europe in the EU, right? The biggest multilateral experiment of the lot. And all that's true, and all that has happened. But the states that were not in it was China, India, Indonesia. They're the places we flew over on the way to Europe, in their poverty. And we've reached a point, as I said earlier, now, where these great states have blossomed with globalisation, with the size of their economies, and with a different set of national aspirations. So therefore, the idea that these great states of the East line up in a multilateral policy of the Atlantic, superintended by the Americans, is I think, just not going to happen. That's not to say the multilateralism was invalid, or that it was not or that it didn't have utopian underpinnings. It did, and it is valid. But the scale of these other big economies now, and yet we haven't even seen Africa really blossom yet, means that though it's an idea we like and we identify with, everyone giving sovereign power to a common purpose, the surrender of sovereign power to a common purpose, we all think as a rule-based people, that's a good idea. But out there in the big world, out there with 1.3 billion Chinese, and the Russians and the Indians and the rest, I just don't see multilateralism continuing to flourish in the way it was designed. Right?
I'd just add to that from a practitioner's point of view. One of the consequences of the end of the Cold War was a great proliferation of the number of states. Multilateralism has just gotten much harder to do. If you've got, you can look at the World Trade Organisation, if you've got 100 and whatever it is now, 60 countries trying to reach an agreement, that's a hell of a lot harder than it was when the Europeans and the Americans were negotiating things like the Kennedy round.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go upstairs. I can just see up there, yep.
Thank you for being here. I'm just going to ask a question about hybrid regimes. And how do you predict... and how do you predict hybrid regimes will affect multilateralism and state institutions in the future?
I'm sorry.
I'm up in the gods.
So
you're up in the gods. Oh, yeah, there you are. Just say that again if you don't mind.
How do you predict hybrid regimes, either the meshing of charismatic leaders with state institutions or military regimes with state institutions of a democratic nature, will affect multilateralism and domestic policy in the future?
I didn't quite get this. Did you?
I think the question's getting at what happens when there's a sort of assumption that multilateralism is a sort of natural outflow of kind of liberal democratic societies. What happens when you've got more authoritarian, potentially junta-style governments meshing or not meshing with multilateral structures?
Mentioning or not mentioning?
Yep, meshing. Like, do they kind of? Do you have gum in the wheels? Yeah.
Well, I don't quite know how to answer the question. I sort of think I've answered it a bit earlier, really. I mean, as Alan said from the get-go, we've been part of the rules-based system because most of the people who were friendly with us and culturally aligned with us were making the rules, This is not the case today. Other great states are making the rules. Therefore, there is a great presumption on our part that we have the key philosophy, that we have the crown jewels in terms of managing international affairs. And if you look at the last 70 years, you say we've been pretty good at it, But in most of those 70 years, these great states lived in poverty. They're now out and running. We didn't help them at the time. They're out and running. The Cold War's over. So therefore, I think that realism should again intrude on our view of the world and foreign policy, that we can't order up Jeffersonian-type countries with Jeffersonian principles. That's not to invalidate, as I said earlier, what, say, the Chinese government have done with their vast population, In other words, it's not our choice. It's not our choice.
All right, here.
Good evening. I remember a quote from you, Mr. Keating, regarding our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, that he's brilliant. He's fearless, but he lacks judgment. Do you feel vindicated?
Sorry, there's a bit of a sound problem here.
Yeah, no, so the question was, you have said that Turnbull was brilliant, fearless, but lacks judgment. Do you think that judgment is still correct?
Well, I always like to think that Malcolm is a learner, and that he is fearless and he's quite a smart guy, but there are periods in his career where the absence of judgment is evident. One hopes that if he enjoys power and hangs around longer, those judgments get better, and I think he would hope that himself.
All right, over here.
Good evening, thanks for the thoughts tonight. Sorry, I have to adjust this, I'm a bit tall. So my question is, we often talk about China as a single entity, but I think you've hit the nail on the head with the fact there are over 1 billion people there, and there are a lot of internal changes that can contribute to, the stability of a country like that, such as growing Christianity, religion, obviously the wealth, the increase in wealth, and a lot of Chinese people looking outside their own borders with that increase of wealth. So I guess my question is do you foresee, or do you think you foresee any instability in the country with a growing middle class, with all these other ideas sort of penetrating what the government there is trying to prevent, and I see that as an inevitability. And do you think that in itself could affect how we navigate Asia and what's emerging now?
Well, look, the great revolutionary change of our time is the connectivity of all of us to one another. And this is the net, microprocessing and connectivity. And this will change the way the world works. It's already changing the way the world works. Information loves freedom. Information societies do best when they're open and free. So the Chinese are making a specific policy decision that, notwithstanding they themselves want to build an information economy and society, they are putting a suture on it by these official management of the internet and of the management of opinion within it. This can't be good in the long run for China joining the information world, and for innovation with information. So, yet on the same time, as I said earlier, China is a patchwork quilt of prosperities. Each of these provinces are more or less independently run by the same party, but independently run with different forces and different economies, all sort of stretching at the threads. And so at the top of the central government, they've got to try and manage it and hold it all together, and particularly with jobs and employment, it's a very difficult task. You would have thought that the movement towards a more liberal economy, a more liberal society of the kind that the Premier Zhao Ziyang championed and the General Secretary at the time, Hu Yabang, might have taken hold again at a more propitious time in Chinese development. Now they're wealthier, lots of people have got real money, and when people have got real money, they want to have opinions, etc. So you would think, if anything, China would be now becoming even more plural. But it in fact is not. And the great challenge for the Communist Party and for Xi Jinping is to have that effervescence, but at the same time have the official hood sitting over the society. Now, we don't know how this will turn out, you know, and it's not for us to say how it ought to turn out. But in the age of information, you would have to think the party's policy is very ambitious in thinking it can contain the free flow of information, which is now ubiquitous.
Yeah, and there's no greater organisation aware of the fragility of China than the Communist Party of China. Yeah. Question here.
Thank you. My question is in relation to climate change, international climate change negotiations, particularly given that the Trump administration appears to have a different view from the Obama administration on climate change and climate policy. What do you think Australia's position should be in international negotiations, and what domestic policies do you think we should be adopting to address climate change?
Well, we're part of the Paris Accords, but I think most rational people think that for carbon abatement, price is what will do the trick. Julia Gillard, to her credit, introduced a carbon tax in Australia, and it was having success, you know. But this was overturned by Tony Abbott, you know. I mean, the obscurantists of the Liberal Party have won the last couple of elections, and they've had their way on the policy, but they won't have their way on the outcome. We would have hoped that Malcolm Turnbull, who understands exactly what price means in carbon abatement, would at least, where the nation would support him, take this issue on against the right of the party. Not so far. The question is, though, given that their current policy is so fruitless and so costly, the one of positive discrimination against particular sources of energy, that at some point even they will shift their ground. It's a great pity, I think, that Donald Trump is unwinding the Obama policy, because the US is one of the great offenders in the world in terms of this. The real leadership is shown again by the Chinese. The real leaders in climate change are the Europeans and the Chinese. And it is to be hoped some way that America, notwithstanding Trump's presidency, is able to at least hang on to some of the measures which Obama has put into place. But of course, it'd be good if we were encouraging them, and we're not, you know.
Well, I'm afraid for those of you standing near the microphones, we are out of time. And I'd just like to invite my Chancellor and boss to the stage to conclude proceedings.
Well, what a wonderful evening, what a great discussion. I'd like to thank Nick Besley for coordinating the discussion, for Alan Gingell for your very insightful comments. I think we should pay a particular tribute to Robert Mann also, who has been the convener of this Ideas in Society series, and I think tonight is a wonderful testimony to that. La Trobe is very proud. La Trobe is very proud in its 50th year to have this as one of the standout events during the year, and it's great to have so many of the public come along to it. I think it was sold out in about 36 hours. And of course, that's a wonderful tribute to the main act we've had today, Paul Keating. I think we all... I think we all had a sense of nostalgia as we heard the combination of insight, wonderful way with words and parody that we had from Paul tonight. I think we've all been considerably enlightened by his comments, absolutely amazed by the way he's able to be across so many issues and seem to be able to cast light and wisdom on some of these things that seem so confounding to our current political leaders. So I ask you all to join me once more in thanking Paul Keating.